For 10,000 years, we had one answer to the cold: fire. We burned wood in pits, in caves, in the centers of our homes, and we huddled around it, breathing the smoke, enduring the soot, because warmth was not a luxury. It was the difference between surviving the night and not waking up to see the morning. And for most of that long history, we accepted a brutal bargain. If we wanted heat, we had to tolerate poison in the air. The moment the flames died, the cold crept back. But somewhere in the medieval world, buried beneath stone floors and tucked inside the walls of monasteries, a different idea began to take shape. An idea so effective, so thermally elegant, that a single fire lit for 3 hours could keep an entire hall warm for days. No electricity, no gas lines, no moving parts. Just stone, fire, all and an understanding of physics that we have somehow managed to forget. To understand how we arrived at this forgotten technology, we need to go back further, to the engineers who first tried to separate smoke from warmth. The Romans, with their characteristic ambition, developed a system called the hypocaust. Beneath the marble floors of their villas and bathhouses, they built networks of small pillars that created an empty space under the ground. A furnace at one end pushed hot air through these channels, warming the floor above and, in some designs, feeding heat through cavities in the walls before the exhaust escaped the building. The effect was remarkably similar to a modern radiant floor heating system. Your feet were warm, the air was clean, the fire was somewhere else entirely. But the Roman hypocaust had a fundamental flaw. The stone pillars and thin floor slabs could not store much heat. The system demanded a fire that burned continuously, sometimes for hours, sometimes all day, consuming enormous quantities of fuel and requiring constant labor to maintain. In the grand bathhouses of Rome, this was manageable. Slaves and workers tended the furnaces around the clock. In a private villa, it was expensive. And when the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, taking with it the economic systems that supported such labor-intensive infrastructure, the hypocaust largely disappeared from Western Europe. Largely, but not entirely. In monasteries scattered across Northern Europe, monks preserved fragments of the old knowledge. They understood the principle: heat the floor, warm the room, keep the smoke out. But they also understood, through bitter experience in the freezing winters of the Baltic, that the Roman version was not enough. The climate of northern Germany, Poland, Estonia, and Scandinavia was far colder than anything a Roman engineer had designed for. A system that needed constant firing was impractical in a world where fuel had to be gathered by hand, and every log represented hours of labor in a frozen forest. Then, sometime in the early 14th century, an unknown builder, perhaps a monk, perhaps a mason working under monastic direction, made a modification that changed everything. Instead of simply passing hot air beneath a floor, this builder piled granite stones on top of the furnace vault. Large stones, 40 to 50 centimeters in diameter, stacked in a dense mass above the fire chamber. And with that single addition, the entire physics of the system transformed. This was the heat storage hypocaust. The principle was deceptively simple. You lit a fire beneath the stone pile and burned it hard for 2 or 3 hours. The smoke escaped through a flue or a cavity in the wall. The granite absorbed enormous quantities of thermal energy, far more than thin Roman floor slabs ever could. When the fire was extinguished, the furnace cleaned, and the smoke flue sealed with a damper, you opened vents in the floor above the stone pile. Hot, clean air rose through the perforations into the room. No smoke, no soot, no continuous fire. Just a slow, steady release of stored heat that could last for days. We know precisely how effective this system was, because in 1822, a group of researchers conducted a series of experiments on a heat storage hypocaust in Poland's Malbork Castle, a system that was already 400 years old at the time of testing. On the 3rd of April, they lit a cold furnace using just 0.7 cubic meters of spruce wood and burned it for 3.5 hours. When they opened the floor vents, air at 200 degrees Celsius rushed into the castle's banqueting hall, a space of 850 square meters. The room temperature rose from 6 degrees to 22.5 degrees in just 20 minutes. They sealed the vents. By the next morning, the room had cooled to 14 degrees. They opened the vents again, no new fire, and the temperature climbed back to 19 degrees within an hour. On the 5th of April, 2 days after the fire, the air from the vents was still 94 degrees. On the 6th of April, 3 days later, it still raised the room temperature by 2 degrees. On the 9th of April, 6 full days after a single 3-hour fire, the air rising through the floor vents registered 46 degrees Celsius, warm enough to feel on your skin, warm enough to take the edge off a stone hall in early spring. By the 15th century, researchers estimate there were between 800 and 1,000 heat storage hypocausts operating around the Baltic Sea. In Tallinn, the capital of modern Estonia, at least 54 systems have been archaeologically documented, not just in monasteries and castles, but in private homes, town halls, guild halls, and hospitals. The technology had moved from elite infrastructure to something approaching a common heating standard. Archaeologists have even found small ceramic dishes placed on the hot stones directly beneath the floor vents. Water was poured onto them, producing steam to raise the humidity of the rising air. A medieval humidifier, integrated into a heating system designed 5 centuries before the invention of the thermostat. But the heat storage hypocaust, for all its brilliance, had a limitation. It required a basement. It heated only ground floor rooms. And it demanded significant construction. A vaulted furnace, a stone chamber, a perforated floor. As medieval builders sought more flexible solutions, the same core insight, store heat in mass, release it slowly, evolved into a different form, the tile stove, the Kachelofen. Well, the word is German. Kachel means tile. Ofen means stove. But the Kachelofen was not a stove in any sense we would recognize today. It was a massive structure, 1 to 5 tons of masonry, brick, and ceramic tile built from floor to ceiling in the center of a home. Inside, a firebox made of refractory brick could withstand temperatures exceeding 900 degrees Celsius. Above and around the firebox, a maze of internal channels, flues, wound through the body of the stove. When you lit a fire, the hot exhaust gases did not simply rise up a chimney and disappear. They were forced through this labyrinth, surrendering their heat to the surrounding masonry at every turn. By the time the gases finally reached the chimney, they had given up nearly everything. The exhaust leaving a well-designed Kachelofen was barely warm. The numbers are striking. A modern open fireplace captures roughly 10 to 15% of the energy in the wood it burns. The rest goes up the chimney. A standard cast iron wood stove, the kind you might find in a country cottage, operates at perhaps 60 to 80% efficiency. A Kachelofen, with its maze of internal channels and its massive thermal battery, achieves combustion efficiencies of 88 to 95%. Some Austrian designs, using what engineers call a biological combustion chamber, claim 90% or higher. The fire brick used in construction holds 80% more heat than cast iron, while its thermal conductivity is just 1/45 that of iron or steel. The result is a system that absorbs nearly all the energy from a rapid, intense fire, and then releases it with extraordinary slowness. You did not tend a Kachelofen the way you tend a wood stove. You did not feed it logs throughout the day, adjusting dampers and poking at embers. You loaded it with 40 to 80 pounds of well-seasoned hardwood, opened the air vents wide, and let the fire burn fast and ferociously for 1 to 3 hours. The internal temperature soared past 1,000 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, secondary combustion occurred. The smoke itself burned. Virtually no creosote formed. Virtually no particulate matter escaped. And when the fire was done, you closed the air supply, sealed the damper, and walked away. The tons of masonry radiated heat at a surface temperature of 40 to 80 degrees Celsius, warm enough to lean against, cool enough to touch safely, for the next 12 to 24 hours. In well-insulated homes, a single firing per day was sufficient to maintain comfortable warmth through an entire Baltic winter. The heat these structures produced was fundamentally different from what a modern furnace delivers. And this difference matters more than most people realize. Nearly every heating system in a modern home, gas furnaces, electric baseboard heaters, forced air systems, works by convection. It heats the air, the warm air rises, the cool air sinks, dust circulates. The temperature near your ceiling might be 25 degrees, while the air at your feet hovers around 18. You compensate by turning the thermostat higher, burning more energy, drying the air further. A masonry heater produces radiant heat. Then infrared energy radiates from the warm stone surface and is absorbed directly by the objects and people in the room: your body, the walls, the furniture, the floor. Without significantly warming the air itself, the sensation is profoundly different. It feels like standing in winter sunlight. The air is cooler, fresher, easier to breathe. Allergies diminish because there is no forced air circulation, blowing dust and particles around the room. And because radiant heat warms surfaces rather than air, occupants report feeling comfortable at ambient temperatures 3 to 5 degrees lower than they would need with a convective system. Studies from masonry heater manufacturers indicate that homes switching from forced air to radiant masonry heat see a 20 to 30% reduction in the energy required to maintain comfortable temperatures. Some report reductions of 40 to 75% in secondary fuel consumption. The Europeans understood this instinctively. In Finland, the masonry heater, the contraflow fireplace, became the centerpiece of home design. In Sweden, the Kachelofen. In Russia, the massive pechka, a stove so large that sleeping platforms were built on top of it, where the family's eldest members would rest on the warmest spot in the house through the deepest months of winter. In Austria and Germany, the construction of a Kachelofen was a regulated profession. A Hafnermeister, a master stove builder, was required by law to calculate the chimney draft pressure in pascals, model the exhaust temperature based on the length of the internal flue channels, and determine the caloric energy content of the wood that would fit in a single loading of the firebox. Every variable was mathematically modeled before construction began. This was not folk art, this was engineering. So, what happened? Why did the most efficient wood-burning heating technology ever developed, a system that requires no electricity, no gas, no moving parts, and can last for centuries, become virtually unknown outside of Northern Europe? The answer, like most answers in the history of technology, is not about performance. It is about convenience, cost, and the radical restructuring of how we build our homes. The Industrial Revolution changed everything about domestic heating. Coal replaced wood as the dominant fuel. Gas networks spread through cities. Central furnaces connected to ductwork allowed a single heat source to warm every room in a house simultaneously, something a masonry heater, positioned centrally and radiating outward, could not easily do in the sprawling floor plans of modern suburban construction. The thermostat, patented in the 1880s, gave homeowners the ability to set a temperature and forget about it. Convenience became the highest value. The idea of loading a firebox, lighting a fire, and waiting for 2 tons of stone to warm up felt primitive compared to flipping a switch. There were also physical barriers. A masonry heater weighs between 1 and 5 tons. It requires a reinforced foundation. It must be planned into a home's design from the beginning. You cannot easily retrofit one into an existing structure. The cost of a professionally built Kachelofen ranges from $15,000 to $40,000, depending on materials and complexity. In North America, where the technology never established a foothold, building codes did not even include provisions for masonry heaters until relatively recently. The EPA still has no emission certification program specifically designed for them, partly because their intermittent firing cycle makes them difficult to compare directly with continuously burning wood stoves. Skilled masonry heater builders were always in high demand in Europe, and very few emigrated to North America between the 16th and 20th centuries. The knowledge stayed where it had always been, in the guilds and traditions of Central and Northern Europe. But the numbers tell a story that is increasingly difficult to ignore. A modern gas furnace has a lifespan of 15 to 20 years. Over a 50-year period, a homeowner will replace it 2 or 3 times, spending thousands on each replacement plus annual maintenance. A masonry heater, built once, can last for centuries. The heat storage hypocaust at Malberg Castle was still functional after 400 years, when researchers tested it in 1822. A well-built Kachelofen has no moving parts to break, no filters to replace, no electronics to fail. It operates without electricity, a detail that becomes less trivial every year as power outages from extreme weather events grow longer and more frequent across the developed world. And the fuel equation is surprisingly favorable. A masonry heater consumes 3 to 4 tons of wood per year to heat a 3 to 4 bedroom house, roughly 20 kilograms per day. Because the wood burns at such extreme temperatures, It achieves near-complete combustion. From a kilogram of wood, a well-tuned masonry heater leaves approximately 20 grams of ash. There is virtually no creosote buildup, which eliminates the chimney fire risk that plagues conventional wood stoves. The wood itself can be sourced locally, managed sustainably through coppicing, a practice as old as the technology itself, and represents a carbon cycle that fossil fuels cannot match. The technology is not perfect, and pretending otherwise would misrepresent the trade-off. A masonry heater cannot respond quickly to sudden temperature changes. If the weather shifts dramatically midday, you cannot simply turn a dial. The heat stored in the mass will release at its own pace, regardless of whether you want more or less. In mild climates, the system is oversized for the need. In homes where occupants travel frequently, the requirement to fire the stove daily is a commitment that modern lifestyles do not always accommodate, and the upfront investment, the cost, the space, the structural planning, places it beyond casual consideration. You do not buy a masonry heater on impulse, you build a home around one. Yet, in an age of rising energy costs, grid fragility, and a growing awareness that the way we heat our homes accounts for a staggering proportion of residential energy consumption and carbon emissions, the masonry heater presents something that few modern technologies can claim, a solution that was perfected centuries ago, a system that converts renewable fuel into radiant comfort with an efficiency that rivals or exceeds the best modern alternatives, a technology that demands nothing from the grid, nothing from the gas pipeline, nothing from any system beyond a forest, managed with care and a fire lit with intention. The monks who piled granite stones above their furnaces in the 14th century were not trying to invent the future, they were trying to survive the winter. But in solving their own problem with the materials they had, they arrived at a principle that our most advanced engineering still confirms: heat the mass, not the air. Store the energy, then let it go slowly. Build it once, and build it